According to a paper published in the National Library of Medicine in 2024, OCD affects 1 to 3% of the global population. Now, you might think that's not a lot, but it actually means that there are 70 million people with OCD throughout the world. 2022 paper in the Journal of Comprehensive Psychiatry actually estimates that OCD is underdiagnosed, which means that the real number of people with it could be even higher. Now, I assume that this underdiagnosis is caused partly by the guilt and shame that's often associated with OCD, but I guess it's also because getting a psychiatric diagnosis can be very daunting, especially if you've never been confronted to that world before. So today I thought I'd talk a little bit about mental illness diagnoses, how they work, and how I was diagnosed with OCD. Hopefully the topic will be a little clearer to you by the end of this video, and if you're either concerned about a loved one or wondering if you have OCD yourself, maybe the thought of getting a diagnosis will be a bit less scary. Now, I've mentioned already some of the diagnostic tools that are commonly used to diagnose people. The most popular one is probably the DSM-5. Another common system is the ICD-11, which is more used in Europe and other countries outside of North America. But whichever one of these tools we're talking about, each mental disorder is defined by a set of diagnostic criteria, and you have to meet these criteria in order to be diagnosed. This assessment can be done by a variety of mental health professionals, including therapists, clinical psychologists, and also psychiatrists. So you probably already know that there is a huge variety within mental disorders. So you might be surprised to find out that some diagnostic criteria will come up again and again across all disorders in the DSM-5. And this is because they have more to do with figuring out at what point something counts as a mental disorder. One of these criteria is a specific time component. So in order to qualify for a diagnosis, your symptoms will need to either take up or have lasted for a minimum amount of time. The other common criterion is clinically significant distress or impairment. So these symptoms need to have affected you significantly for this amount of time. And finally, a really interesting and important one is differential diagnosis. So this means that in order to know what something is, we have to know what it isn't. So if you have a symptom that seems to point to one specific disorder, first we have to rule out what else it could be. You must determined that these symptoms are not better explained by the effects of a substance, a drug, a medication you could be taking, that they're not better explained by a medical condition that you could have, and that they're also not better explained by a different mental disorder. Now, let's look at OCD more specifically. So in the DSM-5, OCD was previously classified in the category of anxiety disorders, but with the 5th edition of the DSM, OCD was moved to its own category, which is now OCD and related disorders. And OCD in the DSM-5 is defined by the presence of obsessions or compulsions, or both, with obsessions being defined as recurrent and persistent thoughts that are intrusive, unwanted, and cause marked distress or anxiety. Compulsions are defined as repetitive behaviors or mental acts that a person feels driven to perform in response to an obsession. There's the time and impairment components, so your obsessions and compulsions must be time-consuming, which means they take up more than an hour per day, or cause clinically significant distress or impairment. And finally, of course, the symptoms must not be better explained by the effects of a substance, a medical condition, or a different psychological disorder. Now, if I look at this list of symptoms and think back to my early childhood, there were definitely already a bunch of red flags there. But I didn't meet the diagnostic criteria for a long time, because even though these were weird symptoms, they didn't really cause any clinically significant distress. That is, until the summer I was 13. Most people probably can't pinpoint a specific moment in their life that changed things forever, but I can. Are you ready to hear my villain origin story? Basically, I saw a movie. Now, when I say that I saw a movie, that's exactly what I mean. I went to this little store that sold crappy, probably pirated DVDs. I saw one, looked at the back cover, read it, and that was it. It was a horror movie about a girl who gets kidnapped by this serial killer guy and kept in his basement for days, where she starts sympathizing with him and basically developing Stockholm Syndrome. I didn't end up buying the movie. I didn't watch it, and to this day, I've never seen it. But that was all it took, apparently. The seed had been planted. And this is quite embarrassing, because when you hear most people talk about getting scarred for life by a scary movie, they usually at least watched the movie. And usually the reason they get scared is also because the villain is scary and they empathize with the victim. Now, what spooked me was that I started empathizing with the villain instead and wondering what it would be like to be that serial killer guy. The biggest fear at the center of OCD, the fire that fuels it, is the fear of uncertainty. How could I know for sure that I wasn't gonna become a serial killer like that guy in the movie? Apparently the fact that I didn't want a serial kill wasn't enough. Because who knows, I could be lying to myself. I could be in denial and repressing my real desires. I mean, who was supposed to know what I really wanted anyway? Me? In my infinite wisdom, I decided the only way to make sure was to turn to my good friend and worst enemy, the internet. I spent the next days doing nothing but obsessively researching the lives of serial killers. So their childhoods, their personalities, their relationships with their families, and of course, every single graphic detail of their crimes, just to check if I felt a sense of kinship there. After going down many, many, many Wikipedia rabbit holes, I was left knowing way too much about people like Jeffrey Dahmer, Ted Bundy, Ed Gein, all while being none the wiser about myself. And now that I had all this wonderful, beautiful knowledge in my head about what these serial killers did to their victims, I moved away from researching their crimes and towards picturing myself doing what they did to my family members and trying to observe my reaction to it. Now, I know how weird and crazy this must sound to someone who doesn't have OCD. I was trying to gauge if I felt the normal, appropriate amount of disgust towards them, or if maybe there was any trace of curiosity or even pleasure in there. And I didn't realize it back then, but that was probably my first compulsion. And the problem is that if you spend all day, every day thinking about one thing, eventually you're gonna get desensitized. And that's exactly what happened. My brain went from a state of non-stop jump scares to this kind of baseline complacent misery.
Oh, that's real nice.
Along with the steady sense of despair that was slowly but surely growing inside me, I also developed a very real fear that I was going crazy. And it wasn't like I could just walk up to my family and be like, hey, so I thought about stabbing you and I'm not sure if that made me feel bad enough. Do you think I'm okay? So once again, I turned to the internet. I wasn't using it in a very smart way. I was looking for answers on places like Yahoo or Quora, and also literally typing things like how to tell if you are going crazy into the Google search bar. And I found answers ranging from if you have to ask yourself if you're going crazy, you're probably going crazy, to answers like, if you can ask yourself if you're going crazy, you're probably not going crazy. Super helpful, guys. Thanks. I also lost count of how many of these stupid personality quizzes I took that said wild shit like, this quiz is designed by the FBI to screen for dangerous psychopaths. Find out if you're a dangerous psychopath today. And then somehow, against all odds, in this land of misinformation, the acronym OCD started popping up. And that was weird to me because I thought I knew what OCD was, and it didn't seem like it had anything to do with murder, serial killers, cannibalism, any of the jolly things I'd been reading about for the past 2 weeks. So it was kind of like, hey there, little guy.
What are you doing here?
But it kept popping up more frequently, so I decided it was worth checking out a few websites. And suddenly, it was like looking into a mirror. There I was. I can't explain how overwhelming that relief felt. I felt like a person who'd been stranded on a desert planet and screaming down this long, dark tunnel, and I'd finally heard the echo of another human voice from the other end. And best of all, I got validation, proof that these thoughts I was having were not reflective of who I was as a person. I swear to God, I wanted to hug whoever was behind those websites. I wanted to shower them with flowers and tell them just thank you. Thank you so much for confirming that these thoughts are distressing and unwanted. I never would have known that from just being distressed and not wanting them. And that meant instead of doing pointless research about serial killers, now I could instead read everything there was to know about OCD. Now, all that research did end up making me a bit cocky. I'd always been taught that knowledge is power. So I thought, as long as I read everything I can about OCD and figure out how it works, that means that it won't have any power over me anymore. And believing that is what gave me the confidence to come out to my parents about it. Mom, Dad, there's something I have to tell you. I realized that I have a mental disorder called OCD, but not to worry. I've done a lot of research about it, and I figured out that these thoughts and symptoms I'm having are a result of irrational thought patterns. Now, all I have to do is think rationally, and this will never be a problem again.
Over 1 month later.
Yeah, this is a problem. Please help me find a therapist. I'd been a bit too optimistic, because even though
knowing is half the battle.
turns out there's a pretty big half left. Joe, my parents, God bless them, did find me a therapist. Now, I came prepared with basically a mini presentation, minus the actual PowerPoint. And I told my therapist, hey, I sought out your help because I've been dealing with some of these symptoms for some time now, and they seem to be bothering me more than a normal amount. I did some research, and it seems that these symptoms match the description of something called OCD. So I think I may have OCD. As a professional, do you think that sounds likely? Now, she listened very carefully to me, asked a bunch of follow-up questions, and after a while, she was like, yeah, sounds like you have OCD. Obsessions and compulsions? Check. Clinically significant distress? Check. Not better explained by a substance, medical condition, or other mental disorder? Check. So there you have it. That's the story of how I got diagnosed with OCD and how my life is now perfect as a result. I'm kidding, obviously. I'm still in therapy today, and throughout the years I've gone through a few different therapists, some being better than others, and I still deeply believe in the benefits of therapy today. I think it's really mostly because of that I managed to get such a relative level of control over my OCD. And if I hadn't gone through the very messy and ultimately rewarding process of getting diagnosed, I would not have the level of understanding of OCD, but also just of myself generally, that I have today. And that's something I wish for everyone who deals with a mental disorder, whether it's OCD or something else. Having a mental illness can feel like being inside your head means walking into a house full of booby traps. Yeah, there's always gonna be some unpredictable traps and weird shit around the corner that you're not gonna be expecting. But walking inside the house with your eyes open and at least half a roadmap is already gonna make a world of difference. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, feel free to like and subscribe for more content like this, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.